Hello everyone and welcome. In this video, we're gonna explore one of the most fascinating, controversial, and misunderstood figures in the history of the Islamic world, the Turkic world, and medieval literature. His name was Seyid Imadeddin Nasimi. For centuries, Nasimi has been remembered as a fearless poet who supposedly smiled while being skinned alive for his beliefs. The story has inspired poets, artists, scholars, musicians, and political activists from Azerbaijan to Turkey, from Iran to Central Asia. But what if the story we have all heard is only part of the truth? What if the famous narrative about Nesimi's death was shaped by centuries of legend, folklore, and religious devotion? And what if his execution was not simply about religion at all? Modern historians have begun asking difficult questions. Was Nasimi really executed solely because of his beliefs? Was he actually played alive, or is that part of a later myth? Why did one of the most powerful governments in the Middle East consider a plot dangerous enough to execute? And perhaps most importantly, why does Nesimi still matter 600 years later? In this video, we'll separate documented historical evidence from popular legend. We'll examine contemporary sources written by scholars who lived during Nesimi's lifetime. We'll explore the rise of the Rufi movement, the political struggles of the Mamluk Sultanate, and the intense power struggles occurring across the Middle East during the early 15th century. We'll also look at how modern historians have reassessed the evidence and challenge long-held assumptions. This is not simply the story of a poet. It is the story of power, it's a story of ideas, it's a story of religion and politics becoming impossible to separate. And it is the story of how one man became a symbol that continues to inspire people centuries after his death. By the end of this video, you'll understand why scholars today continue debating not whether Nasimi was executed, but why he was executed and what his death truly meant. Let's begin by stepping back into one of the most turbulent periods in Middle East Eastern history. To understand Nesimi, we first need to understand the world he lived in. The late 14th and early 15th centuries were a time of enormous upheaval. Empires were collapsing. New powers were emerging. Political borders were constantly changing. Religious authorities were struggling to maintain control. And ordinary people often found themselves caught between competing rulers, armies, and ideologies. The Middle East at this time was dominated by several major political powers. One of the most important was the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks ruled from Cairo and controlled Egypt, Syria, Palestine, and parts of Arabia. They were one of the strongest military powers in the Islamic world. Yet, despite their strength, they faced constant challenges. Along their northern frontiers were numerous tribal confederations and regional principalities. Among the most significant were the Arkoyunlu, often called the White Sheep Turkmens, and the Dulkadirids. They groups frequently competed with the Mamluks for influence and territory. The frontier regions between these powers were politically unstable. Loyalties shifted constantly. Local rulers changed sides. Religious movements crossed borders. And charismatic individuals could gain enormous influence among tribal populations. This environment created anxiety among governments. Any movement capable of attracting large numbers of followers could potentially become a political threat. Today, we often separate religion and politics into different categories. Medieval governments rarely made that distinction. A religious movement could quickly become a political movement. Political movement could present itself as a religious mission. A charismatic preacher could become a political leader, and a poet could become something much more dangerous. This broader context is essential for understanding why Nasimi attracted so much attention from authorities. His poetry was not simply literature. His ideas were not merely theology. Everything occurred within a world where intellectual influence and political influence were deeply interconnected. When we place Nasimi into this environment, his story begins to look very different from the simple narrative of a poet persecuting solely for religious reasons. Instead, we begin to see the complex intersection of power, identity, religion, language, and state security. And at the center of it all was rapidly growing movement known as Hurufism.
Recording in progress.
So, who exactly was Nasimi? The answer depends on who you ask. To some people, he was a saint. To others, he was a heretic. To literary historians, he was one of the greatest poets in Turkic history. And the political authorities of his time, he may have represented something far more concerning. Nesimi was born sometime during the second half of the 14th century. Although scholars continue debating details of his early life, most agree that he was educated in Arabic, Persian, and Turkic languages. His multilingual education allowed him to communicate with diverse audiences across the Islamic world. One of the most important turning points in his life was his connection to Fazlullah Astarabadi, the founder of the Hurufi movement. Fazlullah developed a highly unconventional system of mystical interpretation centered on letters, language, and hidden meanings within sacred texts. After Fazlullah was executed, Nesimi became one of the most important promoters of Sufi ideas. But Nasimi did something extraordinary. Instead of limiting his teaching to elite scholars, he communicated them in accessible language. He wrote extensively in Turkic vernacular. This decision had enormous consequences. At the time, many intellectual works were produced in Arabic or Persian. By writing in a language that ordinary Turkic speaking populations could understand, Nesimi dramatically expanded his audience. His poetry was powerful, it was emotional, it was philosophical, and it addressed profound questions about humanity, divinity, identity, and existence. Many listeners found these ideas inspiring, others considered them dangerous. His popularity spread across regions that they include Azerbaijan, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. This widespread influence transformed Nesimi from a local intellectual into a trans-regional figure, and that popularity may have contributed significantly to his eventual downfall. Modern scholars such as Kathleen Burrill emphasize that Nisimi's literary influence extended far beyond theological debates. His work helped shape early Turkic literary culture. His poetry contributed to the development of a shared intellectual identity among Turkic-speaking communities. In a political fragmented environment, that kind of cultural influence could attract attention from governments, whether Nesimi intended it or not. His ideas reach thousands of people, and once ideas begin spreading across borders, rulers start paying attention.
Recording in progress.
Now we arrive at one of the most important parts of the story. What exactly was Hurufism and why did governments fear it? The word Hurufi comes from the Arabic word for letters. Hurufis believed that letters contained profound spiritual and cosmic significance. According to their teachings, hidden truths could be discovered through the symbolic interpretation of language, scripture, and the human body. To modern audiences, some of these ideas may sound unusual, but what truly concerned authorities was not simply the theology, it was the broader implications of the movement. Sufism challenged established religious authority. It encouraged alternative interpretations of sacred texts. It questioned traditional structures of knowledge, and if often placed charismatic leaders at the center of spiritual understanding. For rules and religious establishments, these characteristics created serious concerns. History shows that governments often become nervous when new movements begin attracting large numbers of followers. The issue is not always what the movement believes. Sometimes the issue is how many people believe it. Modern scholars such as Hamid Algar and Shahzad Bashir emphasize that Rufism emerged during a period when governments were already dealing with political instability and social unrest. In that environment, unconventional religious movements could easily be viewed as potential threats. Authorities worried that followers might develop loyalties that competed with loyalty to the state. They worried about networks spreading across borders. They worried about movements they could not fully control, and they worried about charismatic individuals who inspired intense devotion. Whether these fears were justified remains open to debate. What matters is that many rulers perceived Rufism as dangerous. That perception would have enormous consequences. By the early 15th century, Rufi communities were attracting increasing scrutiny. Religious scholars criticized them, political authorities monitored them, and in some regions, active efforts were made to suppress them. Nesimi stood at the center of this controversy. As one of the Hurufism's most visible and influential advocates, he became a symbol of the movement itself. For supporters, he represented spiritual truth and intellectual freedom. For opponents, he represented theological deviation and social instability. This tension would eventually lead us to Aleppo, where one of the most famous and controversial trials in medieval Islamic history would unfold. And that is exactly where we'll continue in the next part of this.
Recording in progress.
Welcome back. In the previous section, we explored Nasimi's rise as a poet, intellectual, and leading advocate of Sufi teachings. Now we arrive at the event that would define his legacy forever, his arrest and trial in Aleppo. Aleppo was one of the most important cities of the Mamluk Sultanate. It was a major center of trade, scholarship, religion, and military administration. Because of its strategic location, it also sat at the crossroads of competing political influences. Ideas moved through Aleppo, merchants moved through Aleppo, armies moved through Aleppo, and so did religious movements. By the early 15th century, Nesimi had attracted both devoted followers and determined enemies. According to historical sources, complaints about his teaching eventually reached local religious authorities. Some scholars accused him of spreading doctrines that contradicted accepted Islamic beliefs. Others viewed Sufi teachings as dangerously innovative. The specific accusations varied. centered on theological issues. Others focus on statements attributed to Nasimi by opponents. Unfortunately, historians face a challenge here. Any original records from the trial itself have not survived in complete form. What we know comes largely from later chroniclers and contemporary historical accounts. This means that historians must carefully compare sources rather than relying on a single narrative. One of the most intriguing details is that local authorities reportedly hesitated before carrying out a final decision. Why? Because Nesimi appears to have enjoyed considerable popularity. Executing a well-known public figure was not always politically simple. A controversial execution could trigger unrest. It could create sympathy for the accused, and it could transform an unpopular decision into a martyr. As a result, the matter eventually drew the attention of higher authorities. This is significant. If Nesimi had simply been viewed as an obscure local heretic, his care might have remained a local affair. Instead, it escalated. The involvement of higher political authorities suggests that more than theology may have been involved. Modern scholars often point to this escalation as evidence that the state viewed Nesimi through both religious and political lenses. From the perspective of the government, this was not merely a debate about abstract doctrine. It was a question of influence, a question of public order, and potentially a question of religion and regional security. As the case moved beyond local circles, the stakes become much higher, and soon the fate of one pot would become matter of state concern. Now we arrive at perhaps the most famous and emotional powerful part of the Nesimi story, the claim that he was flayed alive. For many people, this image defines Nesimi's legacy. According to popular tradition, Nesimi remained calm while executioners removed his skin. Some stories claim he continued reciting poetry. Others portray him as demonstrating miraculous endurance. His accounts have appeared in literature, folklore, religious narratives, and artistic representations for centuries. They are powerful stories, but are they historically accurate? This is where modern scholarship becomes especially important. Contemporary historians have revisited the earliest available sources and compared them with later traditions. What they found has complicated the picture considerably. The key issue is not whether Nesimi was executed. There is broad agreement that he was. The debate concerns the method of execution. When historians examine the earliest contemporary accounts, they encounter a surprising problem. The detailed image of Nasimi being skinned alive does not appear as clearly as many people assume. Instead, much of the dramatic narrative emerges from later traditions. This had led some scholars to propose an alternative explanation. According to this interpretation, Nesimi may have first been executed through a more conventional method, such as beheading. The body may then have been flayed afterward. To modern audiences, this distinction may not seem especially important, but for historians, it is extremely important. Historical research depends on evidence, and when later stories become more dramatic than earlier accounts, scholars naturally ask questions. Why did the story evolve? What details were added? What details were omitted? And what purposes did these stories serve? Some researchers point out that posthumous flaying was not unheard of in medieval political culture. The public display of bodies served as a warning. It demonstrated state power. It discouraged dissent. And it communicated a message to anyone considering similar actions. This does not make the punishment any less disturbing, but it changes how historians interpret the event. Instead of focusing exclusively on religious martyrdom, attention shifts toward political symbolism and public intimidation. Importantly, this debate remains ongoing. Not all scholars agree on every detail, but the broader trend in modern research has been to separate documented evidence from later legendary embellishment. The result is a more nuanced understanding of Nesimi's death, one that may be less dramatic than the traditional story, yet in many ways even more historically significant because the real question may not how he died. The real question may be why the state considered him dangerous enough to kill.
Recording in progress.
Whenever historians investigate controversial events, one question becomes absolutely essential. What do the closest contemporary sources actually say? This is especially important in Nesimi's case because centuries of legend have accumulated around his life and death. The reconstructed historical reality scholars focus heavily on writers who lived during or near Nesimi's lifetime. Let's briefly meet three of the most important sources. The first is Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. Ibn Hajar was one of the most respected scholars of the Mamluk world. He served as a judge, historian, and legal authority. Because he lived during the same period as Nasimi, his writings provide invaluable insight. His work, Inba al-Jumri bi Ibn al-Umr, contains information that places Nasimi's case within the broader context of Mamluk society. The second major source is al-Sakhawi. A student of Ibn Hajar, al-Sakhawi became an influential historian in his own right. His writings help historians understand how religious authorities viewed controversial movements during the 15th century. The third key source is in Taghribirdi. Unlike many scholars, Ibn Taghribirdi maintained close connections to political elites and the Mamluk court. His chronicles provide valuable information about state policy, military affairs, and political decision making. Together, these sources allow historians to move beyond folklore. Instead of asking what later generations believed, scholars can ask what contemporary observers recorded. That distinction is crucial. Historical memory and historical evidence are not always the same thing. Sometimes legends preserve genuine truths, sometimes they transform events into symbols. And sometimes they mix fact and myth together so thoroughly that separating them becomes extremely difficult. This is why modern historians place such emphasis on source criticism. Every document must be evaluated. Every claim must be traced. Every narrative must be compared against other evidence. When scholars perform this work, they often discover that reality is more complicated than popular stories suggest. In Nasimi's case, contemporary sources confirm his execution. They confirm official concern about his teachings, and they confirm that authorities considered him dangerous. What they do not always provide is the dramatic certainty found in later retellings. That gap between evidence and memory lies at the heart of modern debates surrounding Nesimi. Now we arrive at what many modern historians consider the most important question of all. Was Nesimi executed because of religion or because of politics? The answer may be both, but increasingly scholars argue that political considerations played a larger role than earlier generations recognized. To understand why, remember the historical environment we discussed earlier. The Mamluk Sultanate faced constant challenges along its frontiers. Regional powers competed for influence, tribal confederations shifted alliances, and charismatic leaders could rapidly acquire followers across political boundaries. Nesimi's influence extended across precisely these constant regions. His poetry circulated among Turkic-speaking populations. His teachings spread through networks that transcended political borders, and his popularity connected communities that governments often struggled to control. From a modern perspective, poetry may seem harmless. From the perspective of a medieval state, mass influence could be a strategic concern, especially when it crossed jurisdictions. Some historians point to reports that Nesimi's remains were treated in a highly symbolic manner after his execution. According to various accounts, parts of his body were distributed or displayed as warnings. Whether every detail of these accounts is accurate remains debated, but the symbolism is unmistakable. The message was intended to travel. The punishment was intended to be seen, and the audience extended beyond local religious opponents. Political communication often works through public spectacle. Governments demonstrate power not only through laws and armies but also through symbols. Executions can become political threats. They can send message to rivals. They can discourage dissent and they can reinforce authority. When historians analyze the Semi's death in this broader context, they increasingly see a convergence of religious and political concerns. His beliefs may have attracted criticism. His popularity may have amplified official anxiety, and regional power struggles may have transformed a theological dispute into a matter of state security. This interpretation does not deny the religious dimension. Rather, it suggests that religion and politics were deeply intertwined. The authorities may have genuinely considered Rufiti problematic. At the same time, they may have feared the social and political consequences of allowing those teachings to spread unchecked. The result was an execution that has remained controversial for more than 6 centuries. And in the next section of this video, we'll examine what happened after Nesimi's death, how his body became part of a political message, and why his legacy continues to shape discussion of freedom, power, and dissent today. As we continue this journey into the life and death of Nesimi, we arrive at one of the most disturbing but historically revealing aspects of the story. What happened after his execution? Many people assume that the story ended when the sentence was carried out. But in reality, for medieval governments, executions often represented only the beginning of a political message. To understand these, we have to remember something important about the medieval world. Governments did not possess modern communication systems. There was no television, no internet, no newspapers, no social media. Public spectacles often served as a form of mass communication. The body of condemned individual could become political symbol, a warning, a message, a demonstration of authority. According to historical accounts associated with Nesimi's execution, authorities reportedly treated his remains in a highly symbolic manner. Some sources suggest that portions of his remains were displayed or distributed as warnings to rival political actors. While historians continue debating details of these reports, the broader significance remains important. The punishment appears to have been designated not only to eliminate an individual but also to communicate power. This distinction matters. If the goal had been purely theological, a simple execution might have satisfied legal requirements. Instead, the post execution treatment appears to have carried a broader message. Modern scholars frequently note that medieval states often used public punishments as tools of political theater. The audience was not only the condemned person, the audience was everyone watching supporters, opponents, religious leaders, local populations, and even rival governments. Think about what this means. Whether Nesimi was viewed as a heretic, a revolutionary, or both, the authorities clearly wanted others to see the consequences of following a similar path. This transforms the event from a private legal matter into a public demonstration of state power. And ironically, history shows that such demonstrations sometimes achieve the opposite of their intended effect. Rather than destroying a person's influence, dramatic punishments can immortalize them. The state may have intended to eliminate a sin's legacy. Instead, his death became one of the reasons his memory survived. Centuries later, people still remember his name. They still debate his ideas, and they still question the motives behind his execution. In many ways, the attempts to silence Nesimi was may have ensured that he would never be forgotten.
In progress.
Now let's address one of the most important questions in this entire video. What do modern historians actually believe? When people encounter historical controversies, they often expect scholars to agree on a single explanation. History rarely works that way. Instead, historians examine evidence, compare sources, identify biases, and develop interpretations. As a result, multiple perspectives often coexist. In Nesimi's case, three major interpretations have emerged. The first interpretation is the traditional religious explanation. According to this view, Nesimi was executed primarily because his beliefs were considered heretical. Supporters of this perspective emphasize the theological criticisms directed at Hurufism and point to religious accusations made against Nesimi. The second interpretation is the political explanation. According to this view, religious charges provided a legal framework, but political concerns drove the final decision. Supporters of these interpretations focus on Nesimi's popularity, his influence across frontier regions, and the broader geopolitical concerns of the Mamluk state. The third interpretation, which is increasingly common among modern scholars, combines both factors. This approach argues that religion and politics were inseparable within the medieval context. From this perspective, authorities may have sincerely viewed Rufi teachings as problematic while simultaneously fearing the woman's social and political influence. This combined interpretation is particularly important because it avoids imposing modern categories onto medieval societies. Today, many people instinctively separate religion and politics. In this 15th century, that distinction often did not exist. Religious legitimacy supported political authority. Political authority protected religious institutions. Challenges to one could easily become challenges to the other. This is why contemporary historians often caution against oversimplified explanations. Nesimi was not merely a poet. He was not merely a theologian. He was not merely a political figure. He existed at the intersection of all three. And that intersection is exactly what makes his story so historically significant. The scholarly debate continues today because new generations, often historians, keep asking new questions. How reliable are later narratives? How should contemporary sources be interpreted? What role did popular memory play in shaping Nisimi's image? And how do we distinguish between documented events and symbolic storytelling? These questions remain central to understanding his legacy.
Progress.
One of the most exciting aspects of historical research is that history is never truly finished. Every generation revisits the evidence. Every generation asks new questions, and every generation contributes new perspectives. Over the past several decades, scholars have re examined Nesimi's life through fresh methodologies. Rather than relying exclusively on traditional narratives, researchers have compared literary sources, legal records, political chronicles, and religious texts. This process has produced a more nuanced picture of both Nesimi and the world he inhabited. For example, Kathleen Burrill's pioneering work highlighted Nesimi's role in the development of Turkic literary culture. Rather than viewing him solely through a religious lens, Burrill demonstrated his importance as a literary innovator. Hamid Algar's research on Hurufism placed the Simi within a broader revolutionary intellectual movement that challenged established religious and political structures. Shahzad Bashir expanded this perspective by examining the social and ideological dynamics that made Rufism attractive to followers while simultaneously alarming authorities. Ahmet Yaşar Ocak's work on heterodox movements in the Turkish and Ottoman worlds helped scholars understand how governments historically reacted to unconventional religious groups. Meanwhile, Michael Hess and other contemporary researchers have carefully revisited the evidence surrounding Nesimi's execution itself. Their work encourages historians to distinguish between contemporary documentations and later legendary developments. This does not diminish Nesimi's significance. If anything, it makes his story even more fascinating. The historical Nesimi becomes a real human being navigating extraordinarily complex circumstances. Rather than one dimensional military figure, we see a poet operating within a volatile world of competing empires, religious controversies, cultural transformations, and political anxieties. Modern scholarship reminds us that history is not about replacing one myth with another. It's about continuously refining our understanding of the past. And in this case of Nisimi, that process remains very much.
In progress.
As we reach the end of this video, let's return to the question that guided our entire discussion. Who was Nasimi? Was he a heretic, a revolutionary, a political dissident, a mystic, a literary genius, a martyr? The answer may be all of the above. And that complexity is precisely why his story continues to resonate today. After examining the available evidence, several conclusions emerge. First, there is a little serious dispute that Nesimi was executed in Aleppo. The execution itself is well established in historical sources. Second, significant debate remains regarding the exact method of execution. The famous image of Nesimi being flayed alive occupies a central place in popular memory, yet modern historians continue scrutinizing the evidence behind that narrative. Third, the reasons for his execution were likely more complex than a simple execution of heresy. Political concerns, social influence, frontier instability, and religious controversy all appear to have played important roles. Most importantly, Nisimi's story demonstrates how ideas can become powerful forces within society. Words matter, poetry matter, belief matter, and governments throughout history have often recognized the influence of intellectual movements long before historians begin studying them centuries later. Perhaps that is why Nesimi remains relevant. His life raises questions that continue to resonate today. How should societies respond to unconventional ideas? When does dissent become dangerous? Who gets to define autonomy? And how do historical narratives evolve over time? These are not only medieval questions, they are modern questions as well. The story of Nesimi reminds us that history is rarely simple. Heroes and villains often become blurred. Religious and political motivations overlap, and the truth frequently lies somewhere between competing narratives. What remains undeniable is Nesimi's extraordinary impact. 6 centuries after his death, his poetry continues to be read, his name continues to be remembered, and scholars continue debating the meaning of his life and death. Whether viewed as a saint, a dissident, a philosopher, or a literary giant, Nesimi has secured a place among the most influential intellectual figures of the medieval Islamic world. And perhaps the greatest lesson on all is this. Governments may control enemies. Governments may control courts. Governments may control prisons. But ideas often outlive them all. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration valuable, consider sharing it with others interested in religion, literature, and the fascinating intersection between power and belief. And remember, the most interesting stories are often the ones that force us to question what we think we already know. Hold on, we are not finished yet. Let me give you some contemporary historian writings about Nasimi. If you want to stay as close as possible to the contemporary sources, it is important, though, not to put words in their mouths. None of these historians wrote a dramatic eyewitness narrative like later Sufi hagiographies. Instead, they recorded Nesimi as a controversial figure associated with Hurufi doctrines who was condemned and executed by the authorities. Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who writing in Ba al-Jumri Ibn al-Amr, describes Nesimi as a follower of Hurufi whose statements were regarded by religious authorities as heretical and contrary to Islamic doctrine. Ibn Hajar reports that jurists and scholars in Aleppo examined the executions against him, that legal proceedings followed, and that the authorities ultimately ordered his execution. His account is relatively brief and administrative in tone. Rather than portraying Nesimi as a heroic Mercury or focusing on gruesome details of the punishment, Ibn Hajar presents him as a controversial religious figure focusing on whose doctrines led to condemnation by the legal and religious establishment. The emphasis is on the judicial process and the perception that Nesimi's teachings constitute unbelief or dangerous deviation. And al-Sakhawi and Ibn Taghribirdi provide a broader picture of the environment in which Nesimi lived and died. Al-Sakhawi in Al-Dawa al-Lami discusses heterodox movements and individuals viewed as threats to religious authority, reflecting the concern many scholars had regarding Hurufi teachings. Ibn Taghribirdi, writing in Al-Nujum al-Zahari fi Muluk al-Mush wal-Qahira, places events like Nasimi execution within the wider political context of Sultan al-Nuyyad Sheikh's reign. His chronicle highlights the state's efforts to maintain order and suppress perceived ideological or political threats across frontier regions. Neither writer provides the famous later story of Nesimi defiantly reciting poetry while being flayed alive. Instead, both reflect a contemporary Mamluk perspective in which Nesimi appeared as a religiously suspect and socially influential figure whose elimination was considered necessary by the authorities. This absence of dramatic materialism details in the early source is one of the reasons modern historians such as Michael Hess, Hamid Algar, and Kathleen Burrill have re-examined how later traditions may have expanded and reshaped the narrative of Nisimi's death. That's all for today. Thank you for watching and see you on next video.